A poor girl works as a maid in a billionaire CEO's mansion. Unexpectedly, his son stops her and calls. Imagine stepping into a world where every step you take feels like it doesn't belong to you. That's exactly how Emma Wilson felt as she walked up the long winding driveway of the Morgan estate. At just 25 years old, life hadn't gone the way she'd planned. Instead of chasing dreams or building a career, she found herself wearing a plain black uniform, her worn sneakers crunching against the pristine gravel beneath her feet. Every step reminded her that she didn't belong in this world of opulence, where houses weren't just homes, but statements. But here she was, working as a maid for one of the richest men in the country, all to pay for her younger sister Lily's medical bills. Little did she know, this decision would lead her down a path she could never have imagined. The morning fog hung low over the manicured gardens, giving the mansion an almost otherworldly feel. The estate wasn't just big, it was overwhelming. 14 bedrooms, indoor and outdoor pools, private cinemas, and gardens that seemed to stretch endlessly. For someone like Emma, who came from humble beginnings, it felt like stepping onto the set of a movie rather than real life. Yet there she was, trying to focus on her work, while the weight of her responsibilities pressed heavily on her shoulders. She had only been working at the mansion for 2 weeks, but already she sensed that this place held secrets that went beyond its gilded walls. Emma's day started like any other, with Mrs. Porter, the head housekeeper, barking orders about the day's schedule. Mr. Morgan will be leaving for his London trip at noon, Mrs. Porter said, her tone clipped as always. And apparently, his son is returning from boarding school today. Emma nodded, making mental notes. She knew little about the Morgan family, except what she'd picked up from hushed conversations among the staff. There was Alexander Morgan, the billionaire CEO whose piercing blue eyes matched his commanding presence. Then there was James, his young son, whose smile rarely graced the family portraits lining the mansion's halls. And then there was Catherine, the estranged wife and mother, whose name was whispered with equal parts pity and disdain. Emma didn't think much of these details until fate intervened in the most unexpected way. As Emma worked her way through the mansion's vast corridors, dusting picture frames and straightening ornaments, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about today. Maybe it was the quiet hum of anticipation in the air, or maybe it was the sound of raised voices echoing faintly from downstairs. Whatever it was, it made her heart race as she hurried toward the service stairs, eager to finish her tasks before the household stirred too much. But fate had other plans. As she turned a corner, clutching her cleaning supplies, she collided with a small figure, a boy no older than 8, dressed in an impeccable school uniform, his tousled dark hair framing a face that bore an uncanny resemblance to Alexander Morgan. The collision sent the boy stumbling backward. But what happened? Next left Emma utterly bewildered. Instead of brushing himself off or muttering an apology, the boy stared at her with wide, unblinking eyes. His expression shifted from surprise to something deeper, something Emma couldn't quite place. Before she could say a word, he threw himself at her, wrapping his arms tightly around her neck. "Mommy," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You came back." Emma froze, her mind racing to process what had just happened. This couldn't be right. She wasn't his mother. She was just a maid, someone who cleaned floors and dusted priceless artifacts. Yet the boy clung to her as if she were the missing piece of his broken world. Her confusion deepened when heavy footsteps thundered up the stairs. And suddenly, Alexander Morgan himself appeared in the hallway. His towering frame filled the space, his sharp features etched with shock and something darker. Anger, perhaps. Or fear. "What's going on here?" Alexander demanded, his voice cutting through the tension like ice. The boy turned to his father, his face glowing with joy. "Dad, Mom came back. She works here now." Emma stammered, trying to explain, but her words fell flat against the weight of the moment. Alexander's gaze locked onto hers, studying her face with an intensity that made her squirm. It was then that she realized why the boy had mistaken her for his mother. The resemblance was undeniable. Though they weren't identical, there was something in the shape of their eyes, the curve of their smiles, that made the connection eerily clear. The encounter left Emma reeling, unsure of what to do or say. She expected to be fired on the spot, branded as troublemaker, or worse, a fraud. But instead, Alexander did something unexpected. He invited her to his office. Not to scold her, but to offer her a new role within the household. One that involved spending time with James, helping him heal from the wounds left by his mother's abandonment. The proposal was tempting, not just because of the financial security it promised for Lily's treatment, but also because of the chance to make a difference in a child's life. Still, Emma couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling gnawing at her gut. Was it ethical to step into such a role, even unintentionally? Would she be exploiting the boy's pain for her own gain? As the days passed, Emma found herself growing closer to James, forming a bond that neither of them anticipated. He wasn't just a wealthy heir. He was a lonely child, yearning for connection, for someone who truly saw him. And Emma, despite her reservations, couldn't help but care for him deeply. But just as things began to settle into a fragile sense of normalcy, an unexpected twist threw everything into chaos. Catherine Morgan, the woman who had walked out on her family years ago, returned to the mansion under mysterious circumstances. Her arrival set off a chain reaction of emotions. For James, for Alexander, and even for Emma, who found herself caught in the crossfire of a family drama far more complicated than she ever imagined. Now, standing in the shadow of the sprawling estate, Emma faced a choice. Should she leave, preserving whatever dignity she had left, or stay and risk becoming entangled in a web of secrets and lies? The answer wasn't clear, but one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. What happens next? You'll have to wait and see. Emma's decision to stay wasn't made lightly. The weight of the moment pressed on her as she unpacked her suitcase. The soft rustle of fabric against the closet walls, echoing louder than it should have in the quiet suite. She thought back to Ryan's last message, his concern palpable even through text, and wondered how much longer she could keep delaying the conversation they needed to have. But every time she tried to imagine leaving, the image of James's tear-streaked face stopped her cold. How could she walk away from someone who had already been abandoned so many times? The days following Catherine's dramatic return were tense. Alexander seemed more withdrawn than usual. His sharp jawline often clenched as he disappeared into meetings or spent hours locked away in his study. Emma caught glimpses of him pacing late at night, the faint glow of his desk lamp spilling into the hallway. She wanted to ask what was going on, but their interactions remained professional, tinged with an unspoken awkwardness neither of them knew how to navigate. Meanwhile, James clung to Emma like a lifeline, his trust in her unwavering, despite the chaos swirling around them. One afternoon, while helping James with a math problem in the conservatory, Emma noticed a stack of legal documents on the side table. They weren't neatly filed like usual. Instead, they lay scattered, some pages marked with angry red annotations. Curiosity got the better of her, and when James ran off to fetch a pencil, she glanced at the papers. The words, "separation agreement," jumped out at her, followed by terms that made her stomach churn. Catherine's demands for increased alimony, clauses about visitation rights, and something about liquidating assets. It was clear this wasn't just about money anymore. It was a battle for control, one that threatened to pull James right into its crossfire. That evening, during dinner, Alexander finally broached the subject. "Catherine's lawyers are pushing hard," he said, his voice tight. "She wants unrestricted access to James now." He paused, gripping his wine glass so tightly, Emma thought it might shatter. "But I won't let her use him as leverage. Not again." His eyes met hers briefly, before darting away, guilt flashing across his face. Emma realized then that he saw himself failing, not just as a businessman used to getting his way, but as a father struggling to protect his son. Emma found herself caught between two worlds. On one hand, there was James, who needed stability and love more than anything else. On the other, there was Alexander, grappling with his own demons while trying to shield his child from further pain. And then there was Catherine, whose motives were murky, but whose presence loomed large over the household. Every interaction felt charged, every word carefully chosen, yet heavy with implication. As weeks passed, the tension grew unbearable. Catherine began making appearances at the mansion without warning, always impeccably dressed and armed with excuses about wanting to reconnect with her son. But James wasn't fooled. Each time she showed up, he retreated further into himself, retreating to the gardens where he'd first bonded with Emma. It broke her heart to see him withdraw, especially since she couldn't offer him the answers he desperately sought. Then came the day. Everything changed. Emma was working with James in the library when Mrs. Porter appeared, her usual stern demeanor replaced with genuine concern. "Miss Wilson," she whispered urgently, "you need to come quickly. There's been an incident." Emma's blood ran cold. Following Mrs. Porter down the hall, she braced herself for the worst. When they reached the grand staircase, she saw Alexander standing near the foyer, his phone pressed to his ear. His expression was unreadable, but the rigid set of his shoulders told her enough. As soon as he hung up, he turned to her, his blue eyes stormy. "Catherine's taken James," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "She picked him up from school under false pretenses and left with him." Emma's knees nearly buckled. "What? Where did she take him?" "I don't know yet," Alexander replied, running a hand through his hair. "Her driver disabled the car's GPS tracker, but I've already contacted my attorney and the authorities. This isn't over." The hours that followed were agonizing. Emma sat beside Alexander in the living room, watching as he fielded calls from private investigators, security teams, and lawyers. She offered what comfort she could, though her own mind raced with fear for James. What if Catherine decided to leave the country? What if James resisted and she lashed out? The possibilities were endless, each one worse than the last. Late that night, just as exhaustion began to overtake them, Alexander's phone rang again. He answered immediately, his entire body tensing as he listened. "Where?" he demanded after a moment. "We're coming now." He turned to Emma, his expression grim but determined. They found them at a private airstrip outside the city. "Catherine's trying to board a plane with James. We have to move fast." Emma didn't hesitate. Grabbing her coat, she followed Alexander to the waiting car, her heart pounding in her chest. As they sped through the darkened streets, she couldn't help but think about all the moments leading up to this. The misunderstandings, the arguments, the fragile bonds of trust they'd built. Now, everything hinged on whether they could reach James in time. When they arrived at the airstrip, the scene was chaotic. Police cars lined the perimeter. their lights flashing ominously in the night. Emma spotted James first, sitting alone on a bench near the terminal, his small frame dwarfed by the commotion around him. Relief flooded through her as she rushed to his side, pulling him into a tight embrace. "You're safe," she murmured, tears streaming down her face. "I'm here." Behind them, Alexander confronted Catherine, his voice rising above the din. "You'll never manipulate us again," he said, his tone icy. "This ends tonight." For the first time, Emma saw Catherine falter, her polished facade cracking under the weight of consequences she hadn't anticipated. Whatever happened next would change all their lives forever. But for now, Emma focused on the boy in her arms, holding on to him as if letting go might mean losing him again. As Emma and Alexander stepped onto the terrace, the early morning sunlight casting golden hues over the sprawling gardens, an unspoken understanding passed between them. The events of the previous night had stripped away any pretense, leaving behind raw honesty. "I owe you an apology," Alexander began, his voice steadier than it had been in hours, "for dragging you into this mess, for letting Catherine's games affect you and James." Emma shook her head, setting her teacup down gently. "You didn't drag me into anything. I stayed because I wanted to help James. And maybe, somewhere along the way, I started caring about both of you more than I realized." The admission hung in the air, fragile yet undeniable. Alexander's gaze softened as he studied her face, searching for something deeper, perhaps permission or validation. "Catherine won't be back," he said firmly, almost as if convincing himself as much as Emma. "She signed the revised agreement last night after the gala. She got what she came for, a larger settlement. But she agreed to stay out of James's life, unless he chooses otherwise, when he's older." Emma nodded slowly, relief washing over her features. Still, she couldn't shake the lingering concern. And what happens now? With us? It was a question neither of them had dared to ask outright until that moment. For weeks, their interactions had been laced with tension, an unspoken attraction tempered by professionalism and responsibility. But now, standing together under the quiet promise of a new day, the barriers seemed to crumble. "I don't know," Alexander admitted, his usual confidence faltering. "But I do know one thing. I don't want you to leave. Not just for James, but for me too." His words were simple, yet they carried the weight of everything unsaid between them. Emma felt her heart race at his confession, but she forced herself to think clearly. "This isn't just about us," she reminded him softly. "James needs stability. He can't afford another loss, not right now." Alexander reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "Then we'll build something real, something lasting, together." It wasn't a grand declaration, but it was enough, for now. Over the following weeks, life at the Morgan estate began to settle into a rhythm that felt almost normal. Emma continued working closely with James, helping him navigate his emotions while fostering his boundless curiosity. Slowly but surely, the boy who had once retreated into silence rediscovered his joy. His laughter echoed through the halls again, and his bond with his father grew stronger as Alexander learned to embrace the messy, unpredictable nature of parenthood. Meanwhile, Emma and Alexander explored their connection cautiously, mindful of the delicate balance they needed to maintain for James's sake. Lily's recovery became another beacon of hope during this time. The treatments covered by Alexander's generosity proved effective, and her progress was nothing short of miraculous. When Emma visited her sister in the hospital, she found Lily sitting up in bed, sketching designs for a dress she planned to make once she was well enough to sew again. "You've sacrificed so much for me," Lily said, looking up at Emma with gratitude shining in her eyes. "But I think it's okay now. You've found your place here, with them." Back at the mansion, the seasons changed, bringing autumn, leaves that painted the gardens in fiery shades of orange and red. One crisp afternoon, as Emma and James worked side by side planting bulbs for spring blooms, Alexander approached with a small box tucked under his arm. "There's something I've been meaning to give you," he said, handing it to Emma. Inside was a delicate necklace, featuring a tiny pendant, shaped like a sprouting seedling. "It reminded me of you," he explained. "Strong, resilient, and always growing toward the light." Tears welled in Emma's eyes as she accepted the gift, realizing how far she'd come since her first days at the mansion. What had begun as a desperate attempt to save her sister had transformed into something far greater, a chance to heal not only others, but also herself. That evening, as the three of them sat together on the terrace, watching the sunset, Emma felt a profound sense of peace. She no longer felt out of place in the opulent surroundings. Instead, she saw them as a backdrop for the love and connection she had helped create. In the end, it wasn't wealth or power that defined the Morgans. It was the courage to rebuild, to forgive, and to open their hearts to new possibilities. Emma had walked into the mansion as a maid, unsure of her future, but she emerged as something far more meaningful, a cornerstone of a family learning to heal. And though challenges still lay ahead, she faced them with unwavering hope, knowing that sometimes the most unexpected paths lead to the places we're meant to be.